Okay, in this lesson, which is one of two for this week, we're going to talk about indefinite articles and also gender and number. In French, if you'll remember, everything has a gender and a number. They also have singular and plural. So when we talk about um, French nouns, we always have to think about the ideas of le nombre, as you can see here, and le genre, and some people will call that le sexe. And so every noun, a person, an animal, a place, a thing, or an idea, is classified as being either masculine or feminine. Sometimes nouns that will refer to females are obviously female, such as une femme. As we see here, makes sense that that also applies to males, un homme, un garçon. But in most cases, really especially with inanimate nouns or unidentifiable or unquantifiable concepts like courage or bravery, we're going to find that gender is unpredictable. And so you can go through and try and look for some sort of guiding rules, but they each have a million exceptions. So we want to learn the gender along with the noun as we do that. That's very, very important. And as we're doing that, you're going to want to use les articles indéfinis, indefinite articles. And we'll see why in just a minute. So if we look at this table here, we have a table of our indefinite articles for gender and number. And they give you two examples for each. So if you look at, for example, masculin, you have un livre and un ordinateur. It's just two examples of the same thing. So you could simplify this chart by taking one of those out if you'd like. But this is another really great thing to mention here is that they've paired a noun with it that gives it some sort of meaning instead of just memorizing the words un, une, or des. So if we look at this chart here, we have the masculine singular. If a noun is masculine singular and we want to say a, an, or some, but we wouldn't use some since it's not plural. If you want to say a or an, then we're going to use the masculine singular form of un. And that truly sounds like if you were getting, and this sounds silly, but if you were getting punched in the stomach and you could just go like that. But let's say your noun is like table and you want to say a table, okay? We're going to use the indefinite article une right here. And now as you can see for all of the plural nouns, so whenever it's plural and you want to say some books or some computers, things like that, we're just going to use the plural form of des, and that's the same between the masculine and the feminine. So why do we need these articles in French? That's a big difference between French and English. We have to have something before the noun, whether it's one of these definite or indefinite articles that we're going to talk about, or a possessive adjective like my, your, his, her, their, or a number. And that kind of makes sense because we wouldn't say there's a my dog. You know, we only want one of those two things. Either there's a dog or there's my dog. But in French, we really cannot drop that word before the noun. And this is especially apparent when we talk about the word some, because we can often drop that word in English, but if you remember, whenever I have a noun in French, I have to put something before it. And if I'm trying to say a, an, or some, then these are the words that I'm going to use. So once again, if you want to say a or an and you're masculine and you have a masculine singular noun, you're going to use un. If you want to say a or an but your noun is feminine and singular, then you're going to use des. For any plural nouns and we want to say some, even if it doesn't really sound natural in English to do that, we still need to do it in French unless, again, you have one of these other types of articles or adjectives before it. We still do have to add that in there. And so the plural is going to stay the same between masculine and feminine. So again, this is just a rule going back over what we just talked about. Your indefinite articles are what you use when you want to express a, an, or some. Un is for masculine singular nouns. Une, and when we say that, our lips should be very close together, almost as if you're getting ready to kiss someone. Une, and we want to keep our tongue very tight there. And that's before feminine singular nouns. And then before plural nouns of either gender, we're going to use day. And again, we can't omit that day in French unless there's something else like a number before it. A lot of students have questions about, well, when do I use the indefinite article, l'article indéfini, as they're called, you can see up here, and when do I use l'article défini, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And it really depends on either the directions you're given by your teacher, so if I'm directing you to use a specific one on a test, or whatever it is you're trying to express. If you think about it in English, if I wanted to say a dog, well, there's a difference in the meaning that I'm trying to express than if I'm saying the dog. So the same goes for you as you're learning how to express yourself in French. So if we want to make a noun plural, now that we've talked about those articles, we can usually add an S. And sometimes we have nouns that end in EAU. So you have un tableau. Notice how they're using the article with that. Un tableau, un bureau. So these two nouns end in EAU. And in order to make those kinds of nouns plural, we're going to add an X. But it's not really pronounced. Just like the S, that last letter is not going to be pronounced. And as far as nouns that are borrowed from English, that's one rule that you can pretty consistently count on, such as an iPod, un CD, un DVD, un hamburger, a hamburger, things like that. Those nouns that are borrowed from English, we're going to see that they're usually masculine. Now, so that's the difference between singular and plural. Okay, so first we talked about the article, the indefinite article, meaning a, an, or some, that we need before the noun. Just a second ago, we talked about how do we make those nouns plural if they are. Now we're going to talk about how do we make those nouns masculine or feminine. Because some of them can be changed depending on what they're referring to. A great example for college students is un étudiant and une étudiante. So sometimes we can add an E on the end of the word to make it masculine or feminine. Unfortunately, that is really just a question of memorization as to which nouns you can do that with. You cannot do that with every noun. And they usually do refer to people. So what I'd like for you to do is take a moment and repeat after me. Un étudiant. Here, une étudiante. I'm exaggerating that a little bit. Un ami. Or if it's a female friend, une amie. So here we can now hear the T being pronounced, whereas we couldn't here because it's not the last letter of the word anymore. But here, because that next to the last letter is a vowel, the only difference that we can tell with being able to distinguish if it's masculine or feminine is with the context of your discussion or the actual article. Another example, so I'm going to say them and I'd like for you to repeat after me. Un français. Une française. So let's just go back one moment here. So to recap once again, we started out talking about this indefinite article, meaning a, an, or some, and how we need something like that in front of every noun in French. Now we've moved on to talking about how nouns reflect gender and number sometimes. So we've moved from the article to the nouns. And if we want to identify objects or people, we're going to use the phrase c'est. I'd like everybody to try and repeat that for me afterwards. C'est. And that means this is. And just like in English, we wouldn't say this is houses, right? This is only for singular nouns, right? Ce sont is what we would use for plural nouns. So meaning these are. So I'd like for you to repeat that again with me. Ce sont. C'est, ce sont. And you can see here that we have this nice little chunk of language that's really interesting looking to us as native English speakers. But it's a good one for us to learn how to use just as a chunk, to just memorize it as if it were one long vocabulary word for the present. We'll learn the formation of each part of that in just a second, in a few weeks. But here you can see already, you know what c'est means. So once we learn these different other parts, we can really parse that out. So, qu'est-ce que c'est? What is this? You also had a short lesson in your book last week about est-ce que, making yes or no questions. So with this word here, we've changed it into a little more complicated question. Not just, is this a chair, but what is this? So I'd like for you to try and repeat that phrase a couple of times because that's going to be a really important phrase for you. Qu'est-ce que c'est? Qu'est-ce que c'est? And so obviously we would answer it with, this is blah, 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 whatever it was that you were talking about. So we're going to go back and we're going to say, c'est. Here this noun is singular, so c'est un stylo Montblanc. We're going to use that. But if our noun is plural, like this, des classeurs, we're going to use the word ce sont. And that makes sense. That logical question and response chain of thinking can often help us make sense of what's going on in a conversation, in a context in French, and be able to use our French to express ideas. Okay, so that's the first of your PowerPoints that were posted on BlazeView. I'm going to go through the second one here. And now we're going to talk about definite articles. So before we talked about indefinite articles, and it's exactly like it sounds. A, an, or some, it's an indefinite quantity, or it's not a specific item, okay? But when we talk about definite articles, les articles définis, then we're talking about a specific something, okay? And this equates for us in English to the word the. So if you are trying to express yourself and trying to choose between the two types of articles, if you decided that you're going to use an article, you have to think about the meaning of what you're trying to say. If you're trying to say a, an, or some, then you're going to need to use the article indéfini. If you're trying to express the idea of the dog, then you would use the article défini, the definite article. And then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about adjectives, because not only do articles have to agree with the noun, but our adjectives do as well. Now, there's one little difference here with the definite articles. We have four different definite articles. We have le, so again, that sense of being punched in the gut, le. We do not want to pronounce it as we would if we were in a Spanish class, which would be le, okay? This masculine singular form, so if your noun is masculine singular, then we would say le. If your noun is feminine singular, and we're trying to express the idea of the, we're going to say la. And I'm going to skip down here to the plural. So just like the indefinite articles, Your plurals are the same for masculine and feminine, and this word is pronounced les. So that's why it's so important for us to distinguish the pronunciation between these two, because it can change the context of a conversation. If I meant to say the dog, but I accidentally said les chiens, then a French person is going to assume that that's masculine and plural, not just singular. Now our fourth one here that's a little bit different is L apostrophe, okay? And that's used in masculine or feminine when you have a noun that's starting with a vowel. So, therefore, we really have to think about why we are using what word we're using. And then we have to go back and look at the noun itself. And if we're seeing le or la, le or la, before a singular noun that starts with a vowel, and remember a lot of your H words are going to be, they're going to act like vowels because your H sound is silent. Then we're going to need to just jam them up together. We're going to need to contract them with the L apostrophe, and you'll hear me say L apostrophe. So let's go through and do some more pronunciation with these before we move on. Le, la, L apostrophe, les. So again, these are for specific nouns, and sometimes those fall into the category of something that's already been mentioned. So you've already identified the specific thing that you're talking about. And all of these are equivalent to the. So again, if you want to say the in French, if that's the idea that you're trying to express, then this is what you're going to want to use. But remember that we cannot drop those articles like we can in French. So another good question for us to look at is c'est qui? So this is kind of like something that you can learn in a chunk, like qu'est-ce que c'est? So repeat after me. C'est qui? And a logical answer to that in a French class might be c'est le professeur. So imagine your context. This is a great context for distinguishing between the two and how that's based on your self-expression. If you're in the classroom and there is a person standing up in front of the classroom getting ready to teach, and let's say you have a visitor or friend with you that doesn't know the professor, then would you say that's a professor, or would you be more likely to say that's the professor because you're in a specific situation? That is the professor for that class. So, by the same logic here, we would use c'est le professeur. Here's a great example of the L apostrophe. Voici la graffeuse. So I'd like to take a moment to practice some pronunciation. You could repeat after me. C'est le professeur. Voici la graffeuse. Excuse me. Voici la graffeuse. Here's another wonderful example. A lot of times when we are using verbs of preference, here from our translation, we can see that j'aime means I like. We can also use the verb préférer, je préfère, I prefer, or je déteste, I don't like. And it makes sense that we would use a definite article after those because we're talking about something definite that we like. So even if you're talking about a bunch of different red pens, that's still specific. So we would say, j'aime les stylos rouges, because you're kind of demonstrating something specific that you like there. So after all of our verbs of preference like that, we would use the definite article. One other case that we can use definite articles is to designate nouns in a general sense. And in this case, we definitely don't use an article in English. So that's something that you'll see over and over. And again, it's just important to keep in your mind that you have something that you have to put in front of that noun. And if you don't have a number or a possessive, then I've got to think about what article do I want? So in English, we would say I study languages, whereas in French, we would say j'étudie les langues, the languages. And this is, again, another example of how we cannot translate out exactly from French to English. It's also a great example of one of the biggest blunders that online translators make. Another example, ma spécialisation est le chinois. So you can see here in the English, we don't have to have the, but in French we do. So before we get to this with the possession with definite articles, I'd like to mention to you why it's better to memorize your nouns with your indefinite articles. Because if you look at the formations of your definite articles, you have this apostrophe thing. So imagine if you were trying to memorize the gender of a word using definite articles, as we see here, but it starts with a vowel. Can we tell what the gender is from that? No. But that contraction doesn't happen with indefinite articles that we discussed in the PowerPoint just before. So therefore, when you're memorizing your articles, you really want to try and stick with those indefinite formations just for memorization purposes. Okay. So let's go back here. We've already done all of this. Now, we've talked a little bit about possessive adjectives, such as that's my computer, that's your dog. So the words my and your are describing the nouns that follow them, computer and dog. And so therefore they are adjectives. And we're going to learn about those later on in the course. But we can already, now that we know these definite and indefinite articles, we can already start to express a little bit of possessive qualities here. Because if it's specific enough, then we can use the definite article and then the preposition de. Be careful not to get this confused with your indefinite articles. Keep those separate, okay? So we may not necessarily be like, oh, that's his professor, but we can say, c'est le professeur de Paul. Literally, that is the professor of Paul. We see the same sort of contraction there with the de if this noun had been started with a vowel. So you can see here, c'est le professeur de Paul. This is Paul's professor. Because one thing that is very, very important to note is, yes, we're making these contractions, but that's for linguistic and pronunciation reasons. Whereas here, this contraction that we make in English, or this apostrophe S to indicate possession in English, is absolutely not allowed in French. It's not a part of the language. So for our purposes right now, before we learn those words, my, your, his, her, their, ours, we can say, c'est le professeur de Paul. So you can see it's kind of like a formula, okay? C'est, or ce sont, or voici, here is, okay? So you have your introduction there. You have your definite article, the thing that is possessed by the person, and then a form of de. So de Paul et de Guy. Or here, because we have a vowel, Dan. So again, this is something that really it does help you to sit down and think about it as a formula. You have your introductory, this is, these are, here is, c'est, ce sont, voici. Then you're going to use your definite article to talk about the noun that's being possessed, that's being had. And then you're going to say de, of whoever is possessing that thing. Okay, so now that we have talked about definite and indefinite articles, we can move to a different part of the sentence because we've talked about the articles and the nouns. And so we can talk about adjectives. And that ties really nicely in together here because just like those articles had to agree with the noun, adjectives also have to agree. Okay? And think back, way back to your middle school or elementary school grammar lessons. And we're going to remember that adjectives are words that we use to describe people, places, or things or ideas. So we use adjectives to describe nouns. Some examples here of adjective noun pairings in English: serious student, intelligent young woman. What we can see here is, imagine in English if I had written intelligent young man. This word intelligent would not have changed in any way. That's one difference for French because that adjective is going to then change based on whoever is intelligent. Is it masculine or feminine? So it's going to agree in gender and in number once again. So masculine, feminine, singular, plural. Just like our articles. So descriptive adjectives, or in French we call them les adjectifs qualificatifs, normally follow the nouns they modify. So that's our second difference. Here we have adjective and then the noun. In French, that order would normally be reversed. So here are some examples of some adjectives that a lot of them are cognates. They look just like they do in English. And for most of these, we can just add an E for most adjectives onto the end of it to make it feminine. And then when we want to do a plural, we just add an S. So for example, amusant is the masculine form, but amusante with the E is the feminine form. So let's do some pronunciation of masculine feminine here. Amusant, amusante. Brillant, brillante. Charmant, charmante. Content, contente, which would mean really more happy rather than content. Doué, doué. We don't hear too much of a difference because you've already got that A sound in there with that E. As you can see, all of these have that T. Embêtant, embêtante. Fascinant, fascinante. Impatient, impatiente. Important, importante. Indépendant, indépendante. Intelligent, intelligente. Intéressant, intéressante. Méchant, méchante. Patient, patiente. Récent, récente. And this is another time that it's really important to signify the differences in pronunciation. So let's say you've had a great French sentence pronunciation up until you get to the word important. We can't just drop off and do English even though it looks the same. We have to think about the nasality of the un, pour, and then we have the ton at the end of it. So here's some examples. Tom, who is obviously masculine, singular, est intelligent. So we don't have to do anything to it. We just leave it as is. That's our starting point form. Now, if we change our subject to Sylvie, then that makes us need to do something different. Because she's feminine singular, we need to add an E. So, Tom est intelligent, Sylvie est intelligente. Here's some examples of some plural adjectives. Ils sont charmants. So you can see here, this is masculine plural, and we've added an S. Elles sont charmantes with an ES. So it's really building blocks. You want to make it feminine, you're usually going to add an E. If you want to make it plural, then you're usually going to add an S. So once you get down here to feminine plural, you've added your E and then you've added your S. Excusez-moi. Okay. In French, when you have a group of people and you're trying to describe them, there can be 5 million women and 1 man, but that 1 man is going to make the description of the group absolutely masculine. So you can see here, Tom et Sylvie sont intelligents. So even though there's 1 man and 1 woman there, it's going to revert to the masculine plural form. L'art et la musique sont importants with an S, not an ES, because l'art is masculine. It's also a great example of why it would be really hard to memorize your genders using your definite articles. You wouldn't have known that, which is why they had to put that there. So once again, we're not going to hear the T or the final consonant when it's masculine singular. But because we have the E on there when it's feminine singular, we can pronounce that T. Pierre est intelligent. Claire est intelligente. For either side, the final S is going to be silent. Ils sont intelligents. Elles sont intelligentes. So I'm pronouncing the T because of the E, not the S. So let's do some pronunciation work. Repeat after me. Pierre est intelligent. Claire est intelligente. Ils sont intelligents. Elles sont intelligentes. So here is going to sound the same as here because we don't have that E there. Now some nouns are already going to end in an E. So they're going to have the same masculine and feminine forms, okay? And there's one exception to this, but let's look at these first before we move into that exception. So as you can see here, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to worry about adding another E on here because they already have one. Now, if they were plural, we would certainly add an S. So let's do some pronunciation work with these words. Célèbre. Dynamique. Énergique. Facile. Inutile. Moderne. Modeste. Nécessaire. Optimiste. Pessimiste. Pratique. Sociable. Timide. Utile. And sometimes when you're memorizing lists of words like this, it's helpful to put them, rearrange them a little bit and put them into categories where they're pairing up. So for example, inutile, utile, optimiste, pessimiste, something like that. Oh, excusez-moi, j'ai cliqué une fois de plus. So we can see here that even though the noun journalism is masculine because we're using le, utile would look the same if we were using something that was feminine because it already has an E. La biologie est difficile, it already has an E, so it's not going to look any different from the feminine form. And the same thing goes for these two here. Now, the one caveat that we have to talk about, and excusez-moi un moment. If we look at adjectives like this that end in an E with an accent aigu, because that accent changes the pronunciation of the word, that's the only time when an adjective ends in an E that we would actually add another E. Only when it has that accent aigu on that E would we treat it just like any other normal noun. Now, we also want to note that the same thing that goes for not reinventing the wheel regarding adding an E onto regular E adjectives is if your adjective already ends in S. So, for example, the adjective for someone who is from Senegal is Senegalais, and it ends in AIS. We don't need to reinvent the wheel for the masculine singular form, and I can show you an example of this if we type it out here. Excusez-moi. Okay, so Henri est Sénégalais. I'll double space it here. Marie est, and we can take that same word. I'm going to copy and paste it. It's easier. But because Marie is feminine, singular, I'm going to add an E. But if I said Henri et Marie sont, now I've got a group that has at least one gentleman in it. So I'm going to have to think about, okay, how do I make it plural? And in this case, it already has an S, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just leave it as is. It's going to look the same as the masculine singular. But remember, because we added an E onto the masculine, or excuse me, the feminine singular form, then if I said Marie et Amia sont Sénégalaises. So there I'm going to go ahead and add an S because once I made it feminine, it's not ending in an S anymore. So that's a really good example of how there are sometimes some things that you need to work out in your head as you're writing and really try and watch for those exceptions. Okay, I hope that was helpful. I'll go ahead and post the PowerPoints that I have had for my other French classes on adjectives. They may be a little bit different than yours, but it might help you to see those as well up on BlazeView as a reference point for later on in the semester as we get more into adjectives and agreement, things like that. So those are just a reference point for later on in the semester. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. Your homework is, as always, due Sunday night as well as your blog, so don't forget about that. And I did extend the testing date at the testing centers until Tuesday the 4th because we had the inclement weather. Now that doesn't change anything regarding Monday night's test session with me, or if you were planning on taking it at ProctorU or anything like that. This is really just for students who had scheduled to take it on Thursday and the university was closed, and so they couldn't get in to do it then. It's giving them another opportunity to take the test. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know.